hear me okay? I usually don't bring my whole library, but it's my comfort. It'll make sense. Anyway, I really appreciated the songs you guys picked up this morning. I got this word in my head since about Christmas time, and I've been thinking about it almost every day since, is the faithfulness of God. And there's always hope, right? And something we can rely on. And of course, we need to be faithful back, but that's been kind of a key phrase in my head right now. I know my prayer life too, when I'm on a ring road, goes up about 42%. So I can relate to that as well. So, but no, we're glad to be here. This is my wife, Maxine. Glad to be along with us as well. So we've been married now for, what, 6 years and a bit, right? Something like that. So I'll tell you a little more about that later on. But again, thanks for inviting us. This is kind of pre-sermon stuff. So the sermon hasn't started yet if anybody has a time clock. Okay? So I'll give you a couple of minutes before we get going here. This is going to be part of my ongoing testimony. And I think that's why I like the song so much that you picked up this morning. So thanks for leading us with those songs. Again, of God's faithfulness. I committed my life to Christ just before I entered grade 12 in the big city of Langenberg. Most of you know where Langenberg is? Anybody been there? Probably through there, right? Or anything else. So that's where I was born and raised. And I'm going to fast forward when I start speaking here about 30, 35 years of just a season of life I went through before we wound up moving back to Saskatchewan or here in Regina. It was a season of, I call it my season of darkness or of loss. Now that can sound kind of morbid, but I wouldn't trade those years now. I don't know if I'd ever want to go through them again, but the intimacy of God that came into my life at a whole new level, I would not trade for anything in the world. So that's kind of what I want to focus on here this morning. So the underlying theme of this is probably hope. You know, and we always need that hope. As a couple of those hymns talked about, we can so easily forget, can't we? And I know one of the most common words, especially in the Old Testament, is remember. Because we tend to forget so quickly about God's faithfulness. So that's going to be kind of the theme that we're going to run with this morning. I went through what was called the dark night of the soul. This is probably 10 years after I became a Christian. And it was nothing like what St. John of the Cross called, there's also a thing called the dark night of the spirit. And I guess the sermon is kind of starting right now, again, if you have that time about. When you go through the dark night of the soul, you've probably all heard of that phrase, mostly what it's about, and there can be a lot of doubts about God, a lot of doubts about the scriptures, a lot of doubts about the supernatural, but at the end of it, usually what happens is you're committed to the mission more than you ever have been before. You know, the two great C's. The Great Commission, of course, in Matthew 28, and the love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength in Matthew, I think it's 22. That tends to be the thing that happens when you go through the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the spirit is at according to A.W. Tozer, a deeper level. The dark night of the spirit is usually around the time you've experienced some kind of loss. And loss can define itself in a lot of different ways. But it's usually a heavy kind of loss that you experience. But when you come through it, the beauty of it is you learn intimacy at a whole new level. With yourself, with one another, but even more so with God. Isaiah 45 talks about the treasures of darkness. You're familiar with that? The silver linings of loss in life. You can also go to Hebrews 11 if you want on that. You know, the great Hall of Faith chapter. And what happens there? All these great promises these women and men of God have had. How many of them saw them fulfilled in their lifetime? You got it. 0. But they knew God, and they planted seeds, and we're the benefit of stuff that happened, hundreds and even thousands of years ago, that they probably had. They had glimpses, but no idea. So the dark night of the spirit creates intimacy, but it challenges your faith at a whole new level. When I went through the dark night of the soul, I started to doubt my commitment. I started to doubt God a little bit, maybe a lot for a while, but came through it. With the dark night of the spirit, I hardly had any doubts about God. It was the hardest season of my life. But I could rely on His faithfulness of the previous 30, 35 years. That was there. And that's really what got me through it in a nutshell. 4 books really, really helped me as I went through that. I'm an A.W. Tozer fan. And he had a book called I Talk Back to the Devil. Anybody ever read this book by Tozer? And it's his version of The Dark Night of the Soul. That's really what this book is about, The Dark Night of the Spirit. And he's got a phrase in there called a naked intent unto God. And when you go through a season of life like that, sometimes all you've got is choosing to follow God regardless, whether you feel it or not. And God will give you little nuggets along the way to keep you going. But it's a naked intent unto God. But he gets that phrase from a saint from, I think, the 1300s. I like how they say it, the anonymous author. He was one of the great saints of the past. We do know that. And the book is called The Cloud of Unknowing, which Tozer kind of bases his book on. And it's this whole thing of going through a season of life and a season of life of loss. This is The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, one of the great Catholic saints. I think it was one of Martin Luther's favorite saints as well, so crosses lines. And then this one here, this took me 3 years of reading, but man, it was good. I think I've got something highlighted on every single page in here. By Soren Kierkegaard. It's called Fear and Trembling. And it's also his version of The Dark Night of the Soul. And every Sunday for almost, like I said, it was almost 3 years, I would read a few pages and let it digest and go, through the week on it. It's not one of those fun books to read, as you kind of just blast through in a day, day and a half kind of thing. But this was another one that helped along the way. This is probably the biggest one that helped me along the way, of course. Restudying the scriptures and holding on to those scriptures that God has given me from over the years. So there's 2 scriptures I'm kind of focusing on today. One is Isaiah 45:3, and that's the one that talks about the treasures of darkness. And at the end of that verse, it says that God is going to start calling you by name. And I know we know it, that God knows our name, but He starts to call you by name. And just think about all the billions of people that have lived over the years, and He knows who you are. And that hit me at a whole new level. Like I said, I don't want to sound glib when I say it, but it just kind of hit me at a whole new level. But it's hard when we go through loss, but there's a silver lining of loss. This week I experienced a loss like I haven't experienced before. Not at a deep spiritual level, but at a level of something I just really love. Do we have any curlers here? You're from Saskatchewan, please. You watch curling? Does anybody, come on, some of you watched it. You don't watch curling? Anybody ever throw a curl? What province are we in? It's our provincial sport, for crying out loud. Our provincial dysfunction is the Rough Rider. But it is our provincial sport. So anyway, this is my 53rd year of curling. I'm from a curling family. So I went back to my hometown. We're in this Bonspiel. We make it into the A final. Okay, that's a good thing. We're the last 2 teams standing. We come down and play this team from Manitoba that we really like, but they're outstanding curlers. And we got the game sealed up. We're tied up coming home. Do you know what that means? The last end of the game, last rock, we had it all sealed up. There's no way. We had a rock right on the pin, on the button. It was all covered up with our colors of rocks. But they had one little rock way off to the side, and all the skip had is a long chip. If you play pool, you know what I mean. Think of a Hail Mary shot in pool. And the guy makes it. I really thought it was over. You thought it was over too, didn't you? I think the whole people watch, the 12 people watching, right? 12 people watching, thought it was over too. But we lose. But I'm okay with it. I'm okay with it. I've been lucky enough to play on teams now. We've won over 50 Bonspiels in our lifetime. But without all those previous losses, we wouldn't even be close to that. You follow what I'm saying? That's a good metaphor for life. So you guys, who here has not been born in Saskatchewan? I can't believe you guys don't throw curling on us. You're all born in Saskatchewan, right? Who is not born in Saskatchewan? 3 of you. See, you know what I'm talking about, don't you? Okay, let's go on to real loss. Ones that do affect your spirit. So what happens when you play a country song backwards? That's two of them. Yes. You get your, that's the third one. Goodness. And you get your job back. The big four. That's what happens when you play a country song backwards. That's what I'm going to talk about this morning. One of Maxine's favorite passages in the Bible, or stories, is Genesis 39 to 50, right? From the pit to the palace. The story of Joseph. And I'm not going to get into all the details of that, because I got a funny feeling most of you know this story. Betrayed by his family, goes to jail on a trumped-up sexual assault charge, and it's about a 13-year process of being thrown into the pit. And 13 long years later, I think there's a lot of angst going on during that time. He becomes really the number 2 man politically, probably in the whole known world, in Egypt at that time. But just how God takes him through all this stuff. But, when you read it in 11 short chapters, you go, oh, it couldn't have been that bad. Think of 13 years of angst along the way. But God will give you those, I like to call them too odd not to be God moments, to know that he's still with you. And Joseph had those moments along the way. But I don't think it was easy. Talk about loss, right? Incredible loss, what he had. So I want to focus on Psalm 113. And I think you know what? Where's the bullet here? I just read from the bulletin there. You see the 2 verses in there? I've got it right here. I can read the whole chapter, but just the 2 verses I really want to focus on here. And take a peek. If you have your cell phone Bibles, or I remember the first time, this is going back about 10 years ago, I was visiting the church in Wisconsin where my sister lives. And there must have been about 350 people there, and all of a sudden the pastor says, "Oh, pull out your Bibles," and I didn't hear any pages turn. And there was these, there must have been 150 cell phones. And people are reading the Bible from the cell phones. I know it's become a thing now. But let's read from the bulletin today. How's that? And it says this. It's kind of there's 9 or 10 verses in here, but this is the tail end of it. And he says this, going through a rough time. He raises the poor from the dust, and he lifts the needy from the ash heap. I like the more modern versions of that one, the dung heap, because that's what it felt like in my life. He sits with the princes of his people, with royalty. He settles the childless woman in her home as a happy mother of children. There's going to be fruit as you come through this. That's, of course, the metaphor, the analogy that they're using there. And at the very end of the chapter, going through all this hard time, it says, praise the Lord. God's faithfulness in our lives. He raises the dust from the poor and the needy from the dung heap. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. This became literal for me. And it's going to sound strange, but 6 things happened in an 8.5-year period of time where I was surrounded by royalty in the worst season of my life. In the Bible, we know that many of the passages we read, we can apply to our lives in a very literal kind of way. Many of the stories are history, right? An accurate history. Some of them are parables, or we could call them myths. Now, I want to clarify that word myth. Up until about 1850, according to one of my English profs, a myth always meant a true story. Did you guys know that? Up until about 1850. And then we went from nonfiction to fiction, but myth even today means there's a truism in there that lasts for life. So we need to keep that in perspective too. And a lot of times it is a lesson from history. The Bible's not so much a history book, although we can never disprove the history that's in here. It's more of a book of what? Transformation. So often we make it more a book of apologetics, and apologetics are good, don't get me wrong. John Wesley said that's only a sliver of our faith. I love how he says that. But primarily this is a book of transformation, isn't it? And growth. We sang about redemption a little bit earlier as well. We sometimes wonder about the history in this book. There was a really good Time magazine special, this is about 20 years ago, and it was on the history of the Bible. I don't know if you remember that edition of Time magazine. And the conclusion was this: history has never disproved the Bible, but it's never proven all of history, because up until, it's only from about the time of David on in world history that archaeology can find stuff. It's very rare to find something before that anywhere on the planet. So then you wonder, were some of these stories myths? Were they real? Were they, whatever. So, but I remember, this is just before I became a Christian. No, just after I became a Christian. My parents subscribed to National Geographic. Did your parents do that back in the day? We even had encyclopedias. Do you remember what those things were? And I'm reading a story about 4 people in the Mediterranean that were swallowed by big fish that were still alive. A lot of people in the liberal wing of the church don't believe that was a literal story. Yet there's 4 people they found still alive in the Mediterranean that were swallowed by big fish. One guy was almost 3 days in the belly of a big fish. It doesn't say a whale in the Bible, does it? And all of a sudden you're going, gee, maybe the story of Jonah was more literal than we even thought it was, as an example. The Bible just tends to do that. So this is my story, God's story in my life, that started. He gave me a little precursor in 2008, but the country song in my life just crashed in just a couple-month period of time in 2009. After 27 years of marriage and about 2 years of counseling, my wife called it quits. And I went through a divorce. I really didn't think it was ever going to happen. And I thought we were back in the men, and on Monday, Thursday, the day before Good Friday, I had to preach in Neilburg, Saskatchewan, one of your churches actually. It's an evangelical free church. My ex phones me up the morning of Monday, Thursday, and says the papers are ready. I didn't even know she was getting ready. And I had to preach on Good Friday and Easter. One of my good friends that was at the church, I thought I was just on almost like cruise control. I felt so numb. He said, you actually made sense. So I think God was with me those two days, Good Friday and Sunday. My Australian Shepherd I had for almost 12 years got run over by a speeding car during that same time. Just a beautiful dog. Her name was Jazz. I think I cried for 3 weeks off and on after she got hit. I'm at the church. They didn't fire me, but emotionally I was done as a pastor. So I resigned. So in a sense, lost my job at that stage. You could say I lost one of my vehicles too, because we had to get 2 cars, so my ex took one, and so I lost a car. So there's part of the country song happening right there. I felt like a dead man walking. I went to a pastor and I went to a psychologist over the next 6-8 months, and both of them said, you've got an element of PTSD. There's 5 levels of it, and they said, you probably got about level 3, not that that matters. But for about 6 months, I forgot a ton of stuff. It's like my memory was gone. Something in me told me it was going to come back. I journal. I got all these little journals at home. And to remember stuff, people would ask me about something that happened. I do remember it now. But simple stuff. I couldn't dial it up. So, I was in devastation, for lack of a better word. About a week later, I was still at that church to the end of the month. That was hard. There's a man named Gord at our church from Scotland, and he wrote a fascinating book when he went back to Scotland a few years later. But he was going through a lot of what I was going through too, except he had bipolar. He was an ex-addict. He was working through a divorce. When he was raised in Scotland, this is what his book is about. He was raised in 11 foster homes. In 5 of them, he was abused in horrible ways. You wonder why he had bipolar, or if that's the thing, but you can understand where he was coming from. Finally, at 12 or 13 years old, all of this is happening. He's adopted by a really sweet Christian lady in Scotland. And eventually he made a commitment to Christ, but it was a battle his whole life, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because of his background. And he said, I don't want to go to church this Sunday. I'm mad that they won't keep you on. And I said, well, it was my choice. So he said, let's go have a coffee. And there was a nice little cemetery near Ribstone, Alberta. Anyone know where Ribstone, Alberta is? You know where Wainwright is? Provost, kind of in that area? Right on the border, close to Whiteminster. Really cute little cemetery. They had a picnic table and the rest of it. Let's go, I call it a Jow Church. And for the next 8 years, a lot of my Sundays was Java church with a small group of friends. But we had Java church. And we're sitting down, we're walking. Just a mess, for lack of a better word. And so I said to Gord, this is what I've been reading this week in the scriptures. I don't know if it'll apply to your life or not. I read it and we talked about it a bit. And then he says, what's really been in my heart the last week? Psalm 113. The passage that we're going to focus on this morning. From the pit to the palace, how God's going to restore you after you go through a hard time. And you're going to sit with the princes of your culture and the princesses of your culture. And I just took that as a metaphor. That God's going to restore my life eventually. I knew it was going to be a walk. It was going to be hard. But God was going to get me back. Max is a hairstylist, but it wasn't her that said it. I went to get my hair cut one day because it was kind of... Well, I used to be a mullet man. You guys remember those days? But I went to get a haircut, and this 65-year-old hairdresser who went through Katrina down south had moved back north to be with her family. They were still going through, they never did get their insurance, I found out from all the mess that happened down there. They lost everything in their early 60s. And she says, you know what? And she's a strong Christian. I didn't know it walking in there. And she said, God is faithful, and it takes a while to get your poise back when you go through a mess. That's really what I'm talking about this morning. It takes a while to get your poise back. So it was hard. We've all gone through hard stuff in life. But Psalm 113, again, he raises the poor from the dust. The poor in spirit? And he lifts the needy from the ash heap, or the dung heap. He sits them with princes and the princes of his people. For what it's worth, listen to his testimony of the next 8.5 years of my life. I never could have guessed it would have happened in a literal kind of way. I'm a writer as well, and not a full-time writer because you can't really do that in Canada and make a living. But I thought I'm going to take a couple years off, and I was able to get a couple of writing contracts, but I needed other part-time jobs to supplement my income. And anyway, it started with the Princes of the People. So back in 2005, I wrote a curling book called Between the Sheets. Now, if you look at it, Google it up, you're going to get a bunch of romance novels. And one curling book kind of smack in the middle of it. And one of the clubs I curled at, do you guys remember Cheryl Bernard from the Olympics? Please shake your heads up and down. Thank you, okay. Anyway, she was at one of the clubs I curled at. And I did an article on her for a curling magazine. And we wrote a book together in 2005. Interviewed 110 different curlers from all around the world. It was fascinating. And so in 2010, she qualified for the Olympics. And they won their silver medal in a heartbreak loss that took her about 5 years, well, maybe 2 full years to really get over. So let's do a remake of the first book, and let's write about our Olympic experience, the ups and the downs, the lessons that were learned. And Cheryl was called by ESPN, this was one of our Canadian stations, the queen of those 2010 Olympic Games. But isn't that interesting? The queen, think of royalty. I wasn't thinking of it at the time from Psalm 113, but the queen of these Olympic Games. Gretzky is a huge curling fan. And he said this just before the playoff round started. She won, I think it was 4 or 5 games on the last rock to get there, beating all these other countries. And he said, she has got to be the best pressure athlete at these Olympic Games. And he started going to every draw, just loving it. Not missing the hockey games, but going to all the curling games. So we wrote this book. She was more the researcher, I was the writer. And we wrote about their experience and the silver linings of loss. That's really what it's about. Cheryl's got an interesting background, wasn't raised in the church at all. One day I asked her, as we were writing the other book, I said, who are your 2 or 3 favorite curlers apart from the game? And she mentioned 2 curlers that are very strong Christians. I thought, isn't that interesting? People should agree. It's their integrity. It's their kindness. It's their love. One of the gals was from Regina here, which is pretty cool. Remember the name Kathy Fallman from here? Radical conversion over at Glen Ellen Lutheran Church. Remember that church here in town? So we wrote the book. And then she started doing volunteer work with World Vision. She's been in 3 or 4 trips with World Vision now around the world. But before that, as she approached me, I needed a job after, I laid myself off, basically. But the church is very generous. They gave me 3 or 4 months of severance for only being there for a year as an interim pastor position. I wound up getting a job with the Billy Graham organization in Calgary. He's a Samaritan's person, then we're both based out of there. And Billy Graham has always been my hero. Probably a lot of your heroes as well. And talk about royalty in the Christian church. He's been called royalty in the Christian church. Now, I never met him, obviously. Briefly met his son. But I got to work for the organization. One time they asked me to do just a devotional. They do it every 3 days. They have a preacher come up for about 30 minutes and do a devotional. And I just talked about my history of Billy Graham, and 4 times I went to hear him at various crusades over the years, the impact he had on my life. The head of Billy Graham came up and said, I had no idea of any of those stories. I almost became the unofficial historian for the year I was there. I was the communications manager at Billy Graham. But it's the first year they had to lay people off because 2008 hit, and in the economic point, first time in their history they had to lay people off on the Canadian side. That was one of those new people. About a year later, they got laid off. And that's when Cheryl Bernard came along with the idea, and she created, she got an advance for me to do the book, so that kind of got me through it. After that book, I was working on another book advance, but I wound up working as a manager at a curling club out in Vancouver. And the person that got me the job it was connection to connection, I didn't know her, was Diane Desura. Used to be Diane Nelson. And she was on a team that won the bronze medal for Canada at the 2002 Olympic Games with Kelly Long. If you remember that team. So I get the job, and mostly through her, and loved the job. Really loved it. But she says, you know why we're hiring you on? I met with their board. And they said, we like the fact that you're a former pastor. In my heart, I'm always a pastor, but you're a former pastor. And you've got a social work degree from this wonderful university here in Regina. And she says, we had a lot of needy people in this club. Ever get hired on a job in that department? She said, you're almost going to be our unofficial chaplain. That's kind of cool. And I mean, right away it didn't happen. People had to get to know me. But it started to happen about halfway through the year that I was there. Verse 9 of Psalm 113, these 2 women are going to reproduce. Take that as the metaphor for planting seeds for the kingdom of God as well. There was a father and a son that were regulars at our curling club. He was a junior curler, and the dad would come in and we would talk many times. And it started getting around to spiritual things. Both him and his son eventually committed their lives to Christ. It was worth it for the year, just for that. But there were some other incidences, good ones, that happened through that year. Well, halfway through the year, I get a bizarre phone call. So there's 3 royalties here. Billy Graham, these 2 curlers that were called royalty. And now a hockey player that they said has now entered NHL royalty forever. Bizarre phone call. You remember the 2011 Stanley Cup playoffs when the Boston Bruins beat Vancouver? Do you remember that? 7-game series. Tim Thomas was just insane as the goalie. Who remembers that? Please, somebody here. Oh, thank you very much. He helped me win a hockey pool one year. That's on the side. That's ministry. But anyway, so I get this call, and through a series of events, he phones me up. And his wife, I guess, read one of my books. There's some other stuff behind that. And she fell in love with curling at the Olympics when they were there. He was the backup goalie for the Americans that we beat in 2010. And he had just won the Stanley Cup, the Conn Smythe Trophy, best player in the playoffs, the Vezina Trophy, and 2 ESPYs, which are huge awards in the States, as the number 1, the ESPY's most valuable player for the NHL, and the best playoff performer in any sport on the planet. The only hockey player to ever win it, even to this. It's usually a baseball or a basketball player or football player from the States, or maybe a soccer player from Europe sometimes. He phones me up and says, can you write a book for me? And he paid my way down to the States. I lived in Colorado Springs for a year to work on this book. And he covered all my expenses, and that's how I got my red card before I got my green card when I was down there. But he is still called hockey royalty. Well, from 2013 to 15, I got a tsunami of royalty in my life. I was already working on a book with a gal named Claudia Church down there. If you're a country music fan, this is not a shameful plug, but she's married to Rodney Crowell, who's considered one of the top songwriters in that industry. And so Claudia and I were put together partly through her sister about 7-8 years earlier. But I got an advance from an oil company here in Canada. It's one way to write. To live down there for a couple of years. Got my green card in the process. To live in Nashville, which was just wonderful, and my healing really took off at that stage as well. But talk about royalty, and I'm just going to do this quickly, but most of our writing, probably 70% of it, was at Claudia and Rodney's home in Nashville. They found a little cabin. I wish I had an overheater to show you. It was built in the Civil War, renovated about 4 or 5 times. It's a writer's cabin. Cutest little thing, just outside the city of Nashville, in the country. A little hill with a little creek running through it. It was just gorgeous. It was almost unreal. Nashville hardly ever gets snow, and when they do, schools cancel for a week when that happens. No exaggeration. It's mostly because of the ice more than the snow. But I really missed snow in my first Christmas there, and it was just like one of those mountain scenes if you've been in Banff or Jasper when it snows really nice. And Christmas Eve, that's the snow that happened there. It was just like a gift. I don't know if God did that or not, but I'm just glad the time of being there was pretty doggone cool. Just beautiful. But listen to the people I had lunch or supper with over the next 2 years. And we had some great conversations, wild conversations. J.D. Souther, some of you may know of him, but he wrote a ton of songs for the Eagles. He was in the Eagles in the beginning. I don't know how many, he's been nominated a number of times for Grammys. He's won a couple of Grammys. He was often there. We had a connection. We both were Detroit Tiger fans. That's what his hometown was. Not that that matters, but anyway, he was one of the guys. Guy Clark, who's written a ton of hits over the years, who became a Christian in his last 3 or 4 years of life, which is pretty cool, you know, quite the testimony. He was frequent over at that home. Johnny Cash's grandkids were there all the time. All the time. Because Rodney used to be married to Roseanne Cash. One day I'm helping one of their daughters move their stuff into the big storage area that Rodney and Claudia had. And I picked this box up. I thought, well, this is a really nice wedding dress. Is this from your first marriage? I shouldn't have said that, but I said this to the daughter. Says, no, that's June Carter Cash's wedding dress from when she married Johnny Cash. Now, I'm a Christian and stuff, but I wanted to steal it. But here I'm carrying around June Carter Cash's wedding dress. Royalty, right? Keith Urban, a couple times popped over. He loves Canadians. That was our whole talk. Rodney finally had to shut him up. We're talking about Canada so much. But he loves coming out here. Vince Gill, because that's part of why Rodney wound up in Nashville, was through Vince Gill. Well, our connection was, he's a hockey fanatic. He grew up with it in Oklahoma City in the old Central Hockey League. He's as southern as you can get. So that was our connection. Talking about someone knowing your name, about 2 months later, I'm at this, it was a country event, really a cool thing in this person's barn. Think of a barn that's almost immaculate and all the rest of it. He walks by me and he goes, how you doing, Guy? And I'm thinking, how would he remember my name? But I thought of that thing of God remembers our names. I'm not saying Vince Gill is a God, please don't take that. But I just thought of Psalm 113. Emmylou Harris, you heard of her? Her and Rodney have won, I think it's 2 Grammys now in the last 10 years, singing together again. One day, we're writing on the book, and it's just been our own private concert with the 2 of them in the background. It was the coolest thing. But to see what I'm talking about, just God in Psalm 113 is talking about you're going to start hanging out with the princes of the people. That's how you're going to be restored. Royalty along the way. It doesn't stop there. This is the last one. Since you're all Rough Rider fans, right? Almost, right? Okay, you are. Richie Hall. You guys know who Richie Hall is? We've been friends for 30 years. Long story. He used to live just a few blocks away from here. I don't know if you guys know that. Still lives in Regina. So we've been friends for a long time. He worked it out for another advance, and I moved back to Saskatchewan just at the right time in 2015, 2015, to write his book called Smoke and Beers. I probably got a bunch in the back of my car. Not a shameless plug. You can always go to Amazon. Right there. Sell this together. So I got to work with Richie for 2 years and interviewed about 70 different people. A lot of them would be considered football royalty. But I read an article not that long ago about Richie Hollis, not just football, Saskatchewan royalty. You know, he's spoken in over 110 different communities here over the years, often giving his testimony in schools, civic events, you name it. Cool stuff. You should get him to come preach here sometime. We call him our unofficial assistant in Lipton because he's preached there now, 4 or 5 times in the last 2.5 years. So what happens when you play the CD backwards? 8.5 years later, October 2017, flowed in a little bit into November 2017. I'm reading again Psalm 113. I thought, my Lord, this is literal. What's happening? In a sense, I got my dog back because Mr. Sioux, S-I-O-U-X, because he's from a reserve, I got him at a rescue place in Yorkton in October of 2017. I would have brought him this morning, but we didn't think it was too appropriate, right? I think he's the coolest dog on the planet. I got my job back, so to speak. I was hired by a church in Kipling for 2 years to be the interim pastor. So I was back in full-time ministry. And then I married a prince. Literally married a prince. Talk about the literal things in the Bible. Maxine's maiden name, we got married in November of 2017, was Prince. Coincident? Try not to be God. Take it for what it's worth, but it just kept happening. And I guess I got an extra vehicle back too. She had her own vehicle, I had mine. So he was played backwards completely, all within about 3-4 weeks of each other. Psalm 113. You're going to sit with the, what does it say here again? He raises the poor from the dust. And I'll tell you, I think of poor in spirit there from Matthew 5. Because I just saw at a whole new level, I am nothing without God. It's easy to say, but I think I experienced it at a level I've never experienced before. He lifts the needy from the dust, or the ash heap, and sits them with the princes of his people, the royalty of the culture that you're in. That decade was emotionally, like I thought I was going nuts a lot of times. But thank God for God. That's what kept me. There's no other way to say it. I'm so glad I had all those faithful years of service or relationship before. But again, it was happening at a whole new level. I had to work through some PTSD. I had some so-called flashbacks. But my memory came back to where it was supposed to be. But God was so faithful. I had moved during that time, I counted over 30 times. I lived out of my suitcase for almost 7 straight years. But I know I moved over 30 different times, either house sitting or whatever it was, wherever I had to live. I lived in 6 provinces or states during that time as well, just doing the writing along with part-time jobs along the way. I kind of laughed about this. I had to look it up yesterday. I mentioned to Maxine when I was in Tennessee, minimum wage, and it hasn't gone up. Now it's $7.50. It used to be $7.25 was minimum wage. So there was some landscaping this one family wanted me to do. It was only about a month or 2 of work. And they said, well, we'll pay you the minimum wage. I thought, well, okay, I could use the supplement money, right? I didn't want to go into my Canadian account. After about an hour, she comes up and says, well, you work pretty hard, don't you? From Saskatchewan, right? I said, I'll pay you $10 an hour. And then at lunchtime, she invited me in for lunch, and she goes, my goodness, you're getting a lot done quicker than the other people we hired. I can pay you $15 an hour. There's little things like that that happen. I was a dog sitter, got paid for that. I was a courier for Bumper to Bumper in Yorkton, or on a Langenberg, Yorkton for about a year. I managed part-time a hockey store in Nashville. I learned how to sharpen skates for the first time in my life. And talk about ministry that happened there. It was pretty doggone cool. There was one guy that found out, he overheard me say, well, Red brought you down here. And I said, well, I used to be a pastor at Edmonton. And he went out to the parking lot and sat there for about half an hour. Came back in when no one was in the store, and he goes, are you a pastor counselor? I said, sure. So we had an interesting conversation for the next, I think, almost an hour. See, that to me is the verse 9 part of this, where the reproduction starts to happen, the seeds. It's not just about us, it's still giving back to God as we live. So the paradox, the silver lining of loss. My mom and dad, I lived in their basement for almost 2 years in Yorkton when I came back. My mom had dementia that she wound up in a home close to the time I left Yorkton. She passed away in 2017. My dad just passed away about 6-7 months ago as well. He was 91 years old. But my mom and I always had a tight relationship, but my dad and I, men here, how was your relationship with your dads over the years? Well, I just really got intimate with my dad. There's no other, so I wouldn't trade those 2 years for anything in the world. To be with my dad, to be with him shortly before he passed away as well. He made a commitment to Christ at 61 years old at a Rappel crusade in Yorkton. Isn't that cool? And there was let's say the fruit of repentance. You can see it. It was so cool to see that. I think God really, and I married the ultimate downsizer right here. Spiritually, I think God downsized me to the big three in 1 Corinthians 13:13. What are the three things that we made? Faith, hope, and love. I'm pretty darn satisfied with those things. One with another bonspiel, that's thing inside. But really, that's what it comes down to: faith, hope, and love. And those are really the big three things in my life, more than ever before. I don't know if that would have happened to this degree without the silver lining of loss. And God is faithful. God is good. As I went through that time, honestly, I had zero issues with God. That was never the issue. But boy, I learned that we live in a fallen world. That is just so graphic in my spirit in these last 15 years, more than ever before. I've been mostly a church planter in my life. That's not a plug. That's mostly what I've done. 22 years of ministry. I've been church planting. But people are lost. They're lost. And I know that we are the agents of hope for this world. I think we got a ton of hope. That guy on the radio and stuff, no hope. I don't feel that at all. I think we're living in an Isaiah 5:20 world. Now, I could quote, you can usually quote it quicker than me. It seems to... We call good evil and evil good, that whole thing. I think we live in a society like that like never before. But I remember reading that scripture years ago, or thinking about it. Well, then you must be living in a time of no hope. I think we're living in one of the most hopeful times of all. I'm finding it almost easier these last pandemic years to where we are now to talk to non-Christians about spiritual things. They want answers. And I don't know how often it comes back to the God thing as well. This is a good time for us to be living in. Don't worry if your church doesn't have 300 people or 600 people or whatever it is. We're at a time where seeds can be planted, I think, and are being planted like never before. So let's take hope in that. Embrace, I think spiritually right now we're in so-called a setback time. Let's be honest. I was part of the Lutheran Church, the main one, for 2 years in Kipling. That's my background. I'm more you guys. They've only got now, they used to have, I think it was close to 30 churches in Saskatchewan that would get 200 or 250 people or more. You've only got 3 churches in Saskatchewan now, you get 100 or more. You follow what we're saying? And that's happening in most denominations right now. But I'm a huge John Pasterski, Bridge Bibby fan if you read their research books. They predicted this, back in the 80s, that this was going to happen. You saw the trend 40 years ago, they were predicting this was going to happen. But they said, what's going to happen is the people that have been steady the whole time are still going to be there. And he's going to build us back up. I'm not a prophet. I'm just saying we're at a place where I really believe that can happen because the world is asking questions. They're not getting the answers that they need because of the spiritual void that we all have. So embrace the adversity, so to speak. Why don't I close with James 1:2-4? And I bet you all know this. This took on a whole new meaning for me too in the last, that season of loss. It's always been one of my favorite scriptures, but again, it's at a level that is so intimate for me now. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. And I think the church in general is going through that, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. I think we need that. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be more mature and complete, not lacking in anything. And let's add this one on. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God and give generously into all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. I think we live in some pretty exciting times. Maybe it's going to be like Hebrews 11 and we're not going to see the big, quote, revival in our lifetime. Maybe it's the next generation. Maybe it's going to be our generation. I don't know. I would never predict anything like that. But there's a shift in me before my dark night of the Spirit. I've always known that seed planting is our call for all of us. But we have this tendency, maybe as pastors, to count the fruit more than the seeds. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And I've really come to that stage in life now where it's about planting seeds, because who brings the increase? And we know it, but we don't always really believe it. It's the Holy Spirit. It's God Himself. You know what I get excited about, even out in Lipton? What I get excited about, and we've had some of that fruit growth, what you call it that. But when I hear the regular people that have been going there for years and years and years, and they simply say, you know, we sat down and had a coffee and had a heart-to-heart talk with one of our neighbors, I get excited about that. They might not even have been talking about God, but they're talking heart-to-heart stuff. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. I believe that's what God anoints. That's the seeds we're talking about. Let's just pray for the increase to go from there. So, embrace the times we live in. God will raise us from the dung heap. Amen? Okay, I usually don't preach this long, just to let you know. But it was my story, God's story in my life. So thanks for your patience. I didn't see anybody nodding off, so that's always a good thing. So, what did you know? Anyway, to me it's been a hope-filled service. I really appreciate the songs you picked out. It just really seemed to flow in it where we're going. So, God bless you, and we'll meet some of you here.